right, let's see how we can do this solution for this Room API challenge. So what I've done is I've created two activities, a main activity and a data activity. Now we're going to have a look at them quickly. So for the main activity, there's a layout file, and the layout file looks something like this. So I did not waste time on doing this on the video, so I'm sure that everybody should be able now to do a layout like this. So there you can see my Recyclerview at the top. I've got card views, and inside of the card views I've got my edit text. So there's please enter ISBN of book, the title of the book, the author of the book, and then just a normal button. So if you want to quickly have a look at the coding for your Recyclerview, I've just given it an ID, and you can see that for the height I'm wrapping the content. You'll see at the card view there's all the settings for the card view. Inside every card view there's an edit text. Okay, and basically all of them works the same, and then at the bottom I've got my button. So this is the layout for your main activity. Now let's just look at the data activity quickly. Your data activity, the layout looks something like this. So I've got a picture there at the top. So that picture you'll get into your resources folder, new vector asset. Just go and search for book at the top and you'll get this one. Right, so that's not difficult to get. Then directly after that, I've got a linear layout that is horizontal, and inside of that I've got a delete and an edit button. And you can see for both my delete and edit buttons, I've set the weight property to 1, but the width property to 0. And then for these three edit text, the same as the previous one, where I've got a card view and inside of it an edit text. And then there's the button, apply changes. So in coding it looks like this. There's my image view, there's my linear layout. That is horizontal, weight 1, but the width must be 0 for the two buttons. Then there's the card view with the edit text again, card view with edit text, and then at the bottom we've got the button. Right, so then the last thing I want to quickly look at is, let's just go to the book row layout. So for every single item in your Recyclerview, we've got this layout. So for this layout, you can see I start off with a card view. Inside the card view, there's a linear layout that's horizontal from left to right over the screen. Then from left to right, first will be the image view, then a linear layout that is vertical from top to bottom. Inside of that linear layout, we've got TV title and TV author, two text views. Now if you go to the text property quickly, or the text tab, you will see that this is the basics for the card view. Inside of the card view, there's the linear layout with the image view, and then inside, or just after that image view, we've got a linear layout again with a text view and another text view. And now you can see also for this linear layout that's horizontal, the image view has got a weight of 1 and the linear layout has got a weight of 4, and both of them's width must be 0. And that is it for our layout file. So when we do the Recyclerview later on, we're going to refer back to this as how every item in the Recyclerview should look like. Right, so let's just close all the layout files. So if we go then to the main activity, you will see that there's the Recyclerview, the three edit texts with the button. It's been created, and then we have initialized them, all the edit text and the button and the Recyclerview, and then we only have one button that we need to set an on-click listener. Then also for my data activity, we've got the three edit texts, we've got the three buttons, one to delete, one to apply right at the bottom, and one to edit. And then they have all been set up, and you'll see that right from the start I set the visibility on the apply button. If you look at the previous video again on the challenge, you'll see that this button is hidden right from the start. And as soon as we click on the edit button, then this one will become visible. So I've set also the title, the author, and the ISBN, those three edit texts, also to disable them. So I'm setting set enable to false, to not enable them. Then we also have the buttons, edit, BT, and edit, apply, and delete with all its on-click listeners. So this is what I've done right from the start, and this should not be difficult. This is setting up some basic stuff. So before we do the Recyclerview, let's start with the Room API. So obviously the first thing we want to do here is to sort our data a bit. So I'm going to create a new package, and let's call this package Room and say okay. So inside of the Room package, I'm going to create a new Java class, and let's call this class Book. Right, so let's create this book class quickly, and remember this book class will then become our entity. So we'll need to have @entity at the top, and then for this entity you can also just indicate the table's name if you want to have it different than the class. So I'm going to use book there as the table name. And by the way, if your entities and stuff are not working, remember that you need to go into your build.gradle and you need to add this part there, like I've indicated in the previous video. So this is very important. It must be there also in your build.gradle, your project level. That Google repository must be there. So just make sure that you have these implementations there. Right, so then this @entity should work. Now let's create the field. So we're going to have a private string ISBN. Now this ISBN number will become my primary key. So I'm going to say @primary key. This will also be, I'm going to have non-null there, so it can't be null. And then I'll have a column info there just to indicate that the name here for this column should be ISBN. Right, let's create the next one. So it's going to be private string name. Sorry, not name, title of the book. Right, so now the title for the book, we can also just have a @column info there, and we can say that the name here for this column should be also title. Then the next field will be private string author. Now for the author also, we'll need the column info, and the name there will be author. Right, and that's basically setting up your class. So the only other thing you need to do here is to go and generate the getters and the setters, select all three of them, and you are good to go. Remember that we do not create a constructor here, so we'll rather use the default constructor that sets the ISBN to null, the title to null, the author to null, and then use the setter methods here, the set title, set ISBN, and set author to create my object. Right, so this is step one. It's done. It's creating your own book class. So remember, this book class we'll also use in the Recyclerview as our class that will represent every item passed into the Recyclerview. Right, so then in your Room package again, let's create another Java class, and this one will now become my DAO class. So let's call this one book DAO, and it will be an interface. Right, so also for your DAO, there must be an @DAO at the top, data access object there. Without that, the Room API doesn't know what to do with this. Right, and then we're going to have a few methods here that will help us to add data to the database, or delete or change or whatever we want to do. So I'm going to start with one method there called insert, and we're going to use a book object to insert there. And for this, we can just use the @insert. So that will be easily inserted to the database by just calling the method. Okay, then we're going to have a delete method. And let's also just pass in the book object there. And for this one also, we can just have @delete. Now let's just create another delete method there. And this delete method will take in the ISBN number of the object that you want to delete. So in order to do this, we'll need a query to run. So what I'm going to do here is to say delete from the book table where the ISBN number is equal to this ISBN that was passed into the method. So remember, this spelling there must be exactly the same as your spelling for ISBN there. So that's in your database. What is it called? ISBN. So it's ISBN equals ISBN that was passed in there. Right, so that's another delete method. Let's just try and do a getter type of method. So let's return back a list of books from the database. And then we're going to call this one get all books. So for your import there, just Alt Enter. Right, so this method, we need to have a query also. And the query for this one will be select star from the book table. And let's order this by, let's use the title there. Now just remember again, this title there, the spelling there must be the same as your spelling there for your column. So that is what we have in as a column inside of my database. So let's select star from book order by title. That will get me all my books. So let's say we will only want to get back one book instead of a list of all the books. And we're going to get the book by the ISBN number. So we're going to pass in a string for the ISBN. And then we want to get back that book. So let's run a query again. Select star from book again, but we're going to use a where clause here, where the ISBN number is equal to this ISBN that was passed in. So we know because in our book class, we said that the ISBN number is unique. It's a primary key, which means that if I'm searching for a specific ISBN number, it will return only one book object. Right, and then the last method here will be the update method. And for the update method, we'll just pass in a book object again. And because we're just passing in a book object, it will know automatically what to do with it if you add the annotation at update at the top. So remember that you can add as many methods here as you would like. Maybe different methods to update by using the ISBN number, or whatever you want to do. Maybe get different list of book objects back or whatever. Maybe order by something else. So you can add as many methods here as you would like. Right, so let's create the app database now. So on your room package again, new Java class, and we'll create the app database class. So we just call this one app database as well. And this one will be a class, that's fine. And then at the top, remember that this should be an abstract class, and this class should extend the room database. Right, so very important, that one. And then we'll have an @database tag at the top. Let's just remove that DAO there. The @database tag, and then inside of this, we'll need to list our entities for the database. So the entities will be an array of entities. So in our case, we only have one entity, and that is called book. So I'm going to say book.class. Then the version for this database will be 1, and we will not be exporting the schema. Right, so the only method we need to have inside of this app database class is one that will get back this book DAO. So we're just going to have a public abstract. We're going to pass back or get back a book DAO, and let's call this one get book DAO. So remember that you can call this one whatever you want, but it must be sending back a book DAO instance. Right, so now we have, for the room API, we've got the book class or the entity class, we've got the DAO class, and we've got the room database class called app database. So now we just need to have our singleton class that will help us to create only one instance of this database. So let's create a new Java class again, and let's call this one connections. Right, so from my previous videos that we've done on the room API, we will basically start off at the top with a static variable of type this class, and this one will hold the instance of this class. Let's just call this one instance. We will also need a private app database instance, which this one will be able to connect to later on. Right, so let's have a private constructor here. You'll remember why we'll have this private constructor, so that we don't allow objects to be created outside of this class. So we're going to say private connections, just passing in the context, and then we can start building our database. So inside of this private constructor is where we set up our database. So remember, to set up the database, it's just room.databaseBuilder, and then you'll see the arguments there. We'll need a context, the room database class, and the name of your database. So let's start with the context. Will be this context that was passed in. Very easy. Then our app database class, or our room database class, is called app database, and you must remember to add the .class there. And then the last argument there must be the name for your database. So let's just call this one book_dbase. And then right at the end, we can just call .build, and that builds my database. Right, so this is now a private constructor that sets up my database for me. So now how do we get it back? So we're going to say public static connections get instance. Now we're going to also need to pass in the context here, because we need to pass back this context to my constructor there from this method called get instance. Right, so public static connections get instance. So now we want to use this in a synchronized fashion, which means that only one thread at a time can use this specific class. Right, so this must be synchronized, and I'm going to say if the instance is currently at null, which it will be the first time that you run this, then we want to create or call this constructor. So then we'll say instance should be new connections, and then we're going to pass in the context. So this line there will make a new room database, or create a new room database instance, and that instance will be saved to the app database reference variable there that is contained inside all objects of this class. So here we're creating a new object of type connections, where it will have one field, which will be my database. And then right at the end, we will just say return the instance. So let's say that's the first time that we run this, then we know that instance will be equal to null, and we'll create an object of this class. But if we call this again and it sees that instance is not null, it will just return the instance, which will still be a connection to this object. Now, how do we get back the database then from this class? Well, we also need a public method that will return it. So let's just call it app database and get database. And now here, the only thing we need to do is to return the database variable. Right, so if you remember this from the previous videos, this is setting up this connections class. So basically always the same, just a few things that you can change here and there. So we've got the book, the entity class, the DAO class, we've got the room database class, and we've got the singleton that will help us to get a connection to the database. Right, so now for the next part is we need to go and create our repositories. So I'm going to create a new package, and let's call this package repositories, and say okay. So now you remember inside of our repositories is where we're going to create all these async task classes. So the first one I want to start with is the interface, and let's call this one async task callback, and then say okay. So now for this interface, we basically need two methods. So we're going to say void handle response, and we're going to have a handle fault. Now, the type of this interface, this must be a generic interface so that I can pass in any type of object here as the response. So let's just keep it as this response, and then for this one we'll have an exception object that we will pass through. So this interface will be a generic interface where we can pass in any type of object into the handle response method. So it depends on what we want to get back. In some cases we want the whole list of book objects that's coming back. Maybe on most other cases it's just one single object of a book that needs to come back. Right, so let's go into repositories quickly, and we create our first async task class. So I'm going to create a new Java class, and let's call this one insert book async, and say okay. Right, so I'm going to refer you back to this template that we created. So remember, there was a video called async task template. So that's where we create this template. And in the next videos after that, I've given you a link to this Word document. And you can have a look at this Word document. This is the coding which I will copy from here and use in every single one of the async tasks. So I'm going to copy this one. Copy. And let's paste it over this. So I'm going to basically remove everything except for the package and then paste. So you'll see what we need to change there at the top is to go and change the name of the class, which will be insert book async. Just copy it. That must be the same name for your constructor there. Async task, Alt Enter for your import. For context, Alt Enter. And then there should be no problems at all. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got an insert book async. That's the async class or the async task class, the name for the async task. It must be extending async task, and then these three values you can decide on. Basically, only thing that we're going to change here is the return type. So if we insert a new book, you agree that maybe when we get it back, we want to get that same book that we passed in. So I'm going to use a book object there as the return type. And now I'm going to have a variable here also. Let's say private book. And I need to pass in the book that I want to insert into the database. So I'm going to say book. And then this book will be passed in. And then I can refer to this .book should be the book that was passed in. And it's this one. So this book that was passed in will be set to the book that's part of the async task class. Right, so now we've inserted the book. We've got an async task callback, but let's just change this async task callback to also the type that we're going to return, which must be book at this stage, and the same here. Let's make that one also book. So our async task callback will also be of type book, so that when we call handle response, that will be a book object. Right, so our insert book async, our constructor looks fine. Let's go into, well, I'm going to remove the on pre-execute. I'm not going to use that. So let's go into the do in background method. So my do in background method will also return back a book object. So that one must be a book. And let's also change this string there to a book object that will come back. Right, so let's go into the do in background method. I'm not going to use that part, obviously not this results also. And in the try block, I'm going to use an if statement. I'm going to say if connections, so connections is now referring to my connections class, the singleton class. Get an instance of that class, but I need to pass in a context. So the context must always be the context that was passed into this class. So you'll see there's the context. Don't use get application context or whatever here. You'll use it when you call insert book async. So that's the context that we want. On that context or on that instance, we call get database, which will get the database for me. Then I'll call get book DIO, which will get this class with all the nice methods that we can use. And what I want to do here, or the method I want to use here, is the get the book by ISBN. So I want to first see if the book that was passed in already exists in the database. So the book that was passed in is this book object that is set to this.book. So I'm going to say get book by ISBN. So it's this.book dot get ISBN. That will get the ISBN number of the book that was passed in. And if it is equal to null, which means that the object that you're trying to insert does not exist in the database. So this if statement basically just checks if the book that was passed in already exists in the database. So if it does not exist, which means it's equal to null, then we can insert it into our database. So we'll just say connections.getInstance again, context still the same, get database still the same, get book DIO still the same. But now the method we want to use is now to insert it into the database. And I will just be referring to this.book, which is this one that was passed in. Book was passed in, set to this.book. So I'm referring to that same book object that was passed in. Right, and then the else part there. So this line will then insert it into the database. The else part, I'm going to force an exception to occur. So I'm going to say force a new exception, and I'll have my own message there. So just look at this again. So if the ISBN of the book that was passed in, if that object if we cannot get that object from the database and it is equal to null, then we insert it. What is the else then? It means that this book already exists in the database. So we'll say something like the book already exists in the database. Now in the catch, we set the exception object to E, and then what do we return? Well, let's just return the same book that was passed into your doing background, that was passed into your constructor. So that when it's done here, we can tell the user this book has been successfully inserted into the database. Now in your on-post execute, this is also fine. Everything just stays the same in your on-post execute. Right, so this is inserting a book into the database. Right, let's create another one. So I'm going to go into repositories and let's say new Java class again. And let's create a method called, a async task class called get all books asynchronously. Say okay, so that's the name of the class. I'm just going to go back to that Word document again, get that coding again, and let's replace it. Right, so at the top, run something in the background must be replaced by get all books async. I'm going to copy that one. So I'm using the same name as the constructor, must be the same. Alt-Enter for all of your imports. And then there should be no errors at all. Now, if we get all the books asynchronously, what is the return what we want to get back? Obviously, I want to get a list of all the books. So your return type there must be a list of book objects. Alt-Enter for your import again. Now the same for your async task callback. It must be the same type of return statement there. It must be a list of book objects that will be coming back. Right, so we've got book there, which means that a return type for your doing background must also be, not a book, a list of book objects. And it also means that this must also be a list of book objects. Right, so we've got our get all books async. So if you think of this method and what we need for the constructor, because we're returning back a list of all the books, I'm not passing in a specific book like in the previous one where we wanted to insert something into the database. So my constructor will stay exactly the same. So where can we change something then? We will not be using the onPre-execute method, so just delete it. So now inside of my doing background method, I'm going to delete that line. I'm going to delete this line as well. And then let's just have a list of book objects here. And let's call this list books. And I'm going to set this also to null right from the start. Then inside of the try block, I will now try and get all the books from the database. So how do we do that? So I'm going to say books equals, go to your connections class, get instance, pass in the context, get your database, and then get your book DAO. So now how do I get the books? There's a method called get all books, and that get all books will get all the books for me. And that will be saved into a list of book objects. Right, so now the only thing I need to test here is if this books array, or the books array list, if the size of this is equal to 0. Because if the size is 0, there's nothing yet in the database. And then we can force an exception to occur again. So I'm going to say throw new exception. And the message I will have there will be no data currently in the database. Sorry, there must be a new exception. Right. So if the book's size is 0, it means there's no books currently in that list, which means there's no books in the database. So we throw that new exception. And if that exception occurs, we will get that exception. But if it doesn't occur, we can just return back this books array list. So there it's currently at null. If it succeeds going through this try block, then it will return with a valid book array list with books in it. But if an exception occurs, which means that anything else, any other exception could also occur, it will go to exception equals E there, or we are forcing it to occur here, which will also not get to this return statement. Well, it will get to this return statement, but we'll basically not use it because we're testing here. If the exception is null, then handle response will be called. If the exception is not null, which means an exception occurred, handle fault will be executed, and we won't use that return statement. Right, so this is get all books async. So let's try and go to repositories, say new Java class, and let's try the get book by ISBN async. Say okay. Let's see if we can use this one now. So go back to that Word document again, copy it, replace it again, change the name, get book by ISBN async, copy it, paste it, Alt enter for all of your imports, and then there should not be any problems. So I'm going to remove this on pre-execute method again. I'm going to remove this results and that results. Right. Now at the top, get book by ISBN. What do we want to return back? You agree again, this time we want to have a book object that will be coming back because we are getting one book object by its ISBN. If you look at your methods also that we did inside of the DAO, you will see that if I call get book by ISBN, I get back one book object, and that's what we want to do. Just go back to that one. So get book by ISBN, we will return back a book object. Also, for the async task callback, we'll need a book object returned, the same there. Right, so what do you think we should use here as the get book by ISBN async? What should we receive here? So if I say get book by ISBN, maybe we'll need the ISBN number in order to go and get it. So I'll have a string variable here, private string ISBN. And we pass it in. So this side we can say this.isbn must be the ISBN number that was passed in. So I pass in the ISBN number, I save it, and now I can use it. So your doing background method must be the same return type as what you indicated there. So it must be book. We're going to return back that book as well as for your on post execute. Right, so now in the doing background method, let's just go down there and I'll create a new book object here. Maybe set it to null right at the start. So exception is null, book is null. In the try block, so this is where we'll return that book. Right, so in the try block, let's try and get that book. So we're going to say book equals connections dot get instance, passing in the context, dot get database, dot get book DAO, and which one do we want to use? So in this stage, or at this specific example, we want to use get book by ISBN number. Do we have the ISBN number? Yes, it's called this.isbn. That's the one that was passed in at the top. That one that was saved to this.isbn. Right, so there we have a connection then to that book. So the only thing we need to do here is to check if this book object is equal to null. Because if the book object is equal to null, then this book doesn't exist. So let's throw a new exception here. And the message will be, this book does not exist in the database. If the exception doesn't occur, if the book is not equal to null, then nothing will happen. We will just return the book. But if the book is equal to null, which means this specific book doesn't exist in the database, we throw the exception, this book does not exist in the database. And that is it for this method. So let me just close some of these methods now because it's getting really big with these classes. Right, then go into repositories again. Let's create another one. So let's create one new Java class that will be called update book async. Right, let's just go back to the template again, copy it, let's paste it here. Right, so the name of this class will be update book async. Let's just copy it, paste it there as well. Alt enter for your imports, and then everything should be fine. Let's remove the on pre-execute. Let's also remove this results. Right, so let's quickly have a look at this class. The name for the class is update the book. So obviously we want to get a book object into this class, so that we need to accept a book object here, the one that we want to update. Right, so that's what we're going to accept. And maybe that's also what we want to return back to tell the user this object was inserted successfully. So I'm going to have a book object also return back, which means my async task callbacks return type must also be book, and the same thing there. Now, in order for me to pass in that book, let's just save that book somewhere also. So I'm going to say book. Passing in that book will be this.book equals the book that was passed in. So now we know this is the book object that we want to update. So what are we going to do? Because the return type there is book, the return type for do in background must also be book, and the return or the type we accept there in the post execute must also be book. Right, so let's go into the do in background method now. So now we have the book object that was passed in. What are we going to do with it? So inside of my do in background method, I can first go and check whether this specific book actually exists. So it's going to be connections dot get instance, passing in the context dot get database dot get the DAO dot, in this case we want to call get book by ISBN again. Now how do I get that ISBN? So remember that there was a book passed in, so I can say this dot book, that's the book object. From that book object I can call get ISBN, which will get the ISBN number for me. Okay, and then I just need to test it against something. So I'm going to say if it's equal to null. Let me just open up a bit. So if it is equal to null, it means that this specific person or this specific book I want to update doesn't exist in the database, which means I'm going to throw a new exception. Let's have this one, the book you are trying to update does not exist. Right, so what will be the else part then? Then we can actually insert this book into the database. So I'm just going to use connections again, dot get instance, passing in the context, get the database, get the DAO, and then I can use the method. So I want to use the update method now. So it's this one, and the book that was passed into the constructor there, which is set to this dot book, that's the one we will update. If there's an exception that occurs, we will catch that exception, and what do we return then? Let's return back the book that was passed in also. So at the end we can just say that that specific book has been updated. Right, the rest of this class seems fine, no problems at all. Just to quickly talk about this again, remember that if you have a context inside of an async, this context could leak or could be a memory leak. So it's also very important to remember that if you pass in the context, we'll do it later. If we pass in this context, it must be the application context and not an activity. Right, so let's do the last method there. Sorry, I keep on referring to methods, but you know it's classes. Okay, so right click there and say new Java class. Let's just create this last, not method, class. So it's delete book async. And then say okay. Let's just go back to that Word document again, copy it, and we're going to use it here again. Right, so run something in the background must be replaced by delete book async, and the same name for your constructor. So that constructor must have the same name. Alt enter and Alt enter. Right, I'm going to remove the on pre-execute method again, remove the results. Right. Okay, so let's think of deleting a book now. So obviously I'll need to get the book that I want to delete. Alt enter for your imports. Well, that's one of two things that we can do here. We can delete the book asynchronously by passing in the book, or we can delete the book by using an ISBN number. So I think the one I'm going to use here is just to pass in the ISBN number and then search for that book and delete it. So let's just have a private string ISBN here also. And then we set this.isbn to the ISBN number that was passed in. Okay, so we're going to delete the book by accepting an ISBN number, and then we'll return back that book if it's found and we have successfully deleted it. So the type of my async task callback will then also be book, and there also be book. So why am I returning a book object here? It's because then when we're done deleting, we still have a hold of that object or that book, and we can say that that specific book has been successfully deleted. So we still have the data of it, even though it's not in the database anymore. Right, so now into your doInBackground method, we're returning a book. So this return statement there must be a book, or the return type there must be a book. Also, what you accept in your onPost execute must be a book. Right, so inside of your doInBackground method, what do we want to do here? So I'm going to start off with a book object again, or book reference variable, and then try and get that book now. So I'm going to say book equals connections.getInstance, passing in the context, get the database, get the book DAO, and then use get the book by its ISBN. So remember, we have passed in the ISBN number. So I'm just referred to ISBN there, or you can say this.isbn. Right, and now we know we will get that book if it exists. But if it doesn't exist, that book object will still be null. So let's just do the test there. If book is equal to null, we know the book isn't in the database, so we can't delete it. So we're going to say throw new exception, and the message will be the book you are trying to delete does not exist. Right, and then the else part there will be the book actually exists, and now we want to delete that book. So we're going to say connections dot get instance again, passing in the context dot get database dot get book DAO dot delete. So which delete method should we use here? Well, we've got the book object, so we can actually just pass in the book object and delete it. The other one is passing in the ISBN, and then it will delete it. So it's really up to you what you want to do. So we can just pass in this book object, because we know then it will be connected, and we pass in the book object, and that will delete the book object. Right, what do we want to return? Well, I would like to return back that book object there, whether it's null or not. If it's null, it means in any case that it's going to go to handle fault, because the exception would have occurred there, the forced exception that we did, and that exception will be passed through with handle fault. But if the book exists and we deleted it successfully, then that book will be passed into handle response. Right, so this is then all the repositories. So we've done the Room API files, we've done the repositories. So I think I'm going to pause or stop the video here, and we're going to go to a next video to see how we use these classes that we just created.